Hello, and welcome to the second part of the Lewis Model Explainer, based on the reading material that you can find on Nestor. In this explainer, we go from the basic model outlined in part 1 to the more extended model that's explained in the reading material. And in the basic model, we discussed how the problem was that there's too much labor in agriculture, and that this provides an opportunity for the industrial sector because it provides an unlimited source of cheap labor for expanding the industrial sector. Now, in this extension, we focus on, first of all, what happens after surplus labor disappears, but before agriculture becomes more of a normal sector. And for that, we need a model with industrial wages too. In addition, we more clearly describe how these two sectors are linked, not just by the movement of labor between agriculture and industry, but also the movement of food and how that influences the process of industrialization. Now, if you want to compare the previous model to the charts that we're using in this explainer, this schematic helps. In the figure marked 1 is the agricultural production and labor demand that's discussed jointly. In the second one, that's a new one, we discuss agricultural surplus. And in the third one, we get to the industrial sector with labor demands and supply given in figure 3. Starting off with the first one. So in this figure, we have the agricultural production function. That's the curve over here. And as before, there's a maximum. So the only difference is that this figure is flipped. So if you go from right to left, agricultural labor increases. So between points A and B, agricultural production is at its maximum. So that's why we're in a phase of surplus labor, as indicated here. In the second phase, agricultural production starts to decline as more workers leave agriculture. But still, the marginal product of the workers, even though it becomes positive because every worker that leaves leads to reduced production, even though the marginal product is positive, this is still not a normal sector. Instead, we describe this as disguised unemployment. Workers have positive marginal products, but their earnings are higher than their marginal product. In the third phase, we reach commercialization, and at this point, the marginal product is equal to the agricultural wage, and thus as more workers leave agriculture, the agricultural wage increases. So that's the main features of this figure. Let's now zoom in a little more clearly to understand what the different pieces are about. First of all, it's important to look at the diagonal line drawn through, well, mostly the diagonal line with a W bar at the bottom. So what's this W bar? Well, first of all, we have the agricultural output. Let's call that Y. And secondly, we have agricultural labor down here. Let's call that L. Or better yet, LA for agriculture. So when we're all the way at the left-hand side, then agricultural labor is at its peak and production is at its maximum, call that Y. Now, at that point, all the income that's generated in the agricultural sector, so Y, is used to compensate workers LA. So the agricultural so the wages in agriculture, that the average income is equal to Y over LA. So Y equals W bar equals Y over LA. So the average product is equal to the wage. Now this W bar is also just the slope of the diagonal line running from the origin to the maximum level here on the left-hand side. Now in this the key assumption that is being made here is that throughout the period moving forward until we reach commercialization, the average wage earned is constant. So WA is constant. As we're moving to the left, if you're moving from the left to the right, so there's fewer workers in agriculture, the average product could increase. Because if you are at point B and you draw a diagonal line from here on out, so from the origin to point there, that will have a larger slope, and thus would be representing a higher average product. But we are assuming here that this is not happening, and instead the surplus, so basically the difference between the wage bill holding constant the average product, holding constant the wage, and the production, so this area over here is, we assume that is taxed away by the government. Because only if that surplus is removed from the agricultural sector can we have that agricultural wages are constant. Now this surplus actually increases all the way until you get to the point of commercialization. The difference between the wage bill holding constant W bar, holding constant this average product from the very beginning of the production process over here. That's the amount of surplus that's being taxed away by the government increases. As we get to the commercialization phase, though, workers start having a marginal product that's larger than W bar. How do we see that? Well, the tangent here on the production function has the same slope as this diagonal line here. So the marginal product at this point exceeds W bar. That's why we know that at that point commercialization phase starts. Now from that point on, wages will have to increase to match the rising marginal product, because otherwise people will not, we're at that point, the agricultural sector is a normal sector where workers can demand their marginal product. So that's why we get this hump in so the W bar holds until this point, and then we get rising wages as workers leave. So the wage bill decreases rapidly throughout the first part, but in the commercialization phase, it actually remains constant for a while because the marginal product starts to exceed W bar. So that covers the main points for the first figure. The agricultural production function, the maximum production level at the very top, and the constant W bar, the constant average product, the constant wage that is earned, which is equal to the average product when all workers are in agriculture. Then the second figure, and this is about agricultural surplus. And this surplus, as we saw before, with the distance between the production function and the wage bill, is important because that is being taken away by the government out of the agricultural sector. Um, and this plays another important role, namely by influencing the price of food. Right? So as we see here at the top, at the first phase of this model, the price of agricultural products is constant. In the disguised unemployment phase, there's an increase, and in the commercialization phase, there's an increase. Now, you can imagine that this is the case because we saw here at the beginning in this agricultural production function that at some point agricultural production starts to decline. So the supply of food decreases, demand presumably stays constant because we're assuming that that's based on the people in the economy. So as demand stays constant and supply decreases, prices will start to increase. We can also frame this in terms of the surplus. And what this figure shows is not the total surplus. So the total surplus is the distance between the production function and the wage bill, but this is about the average surplus. And the average surplus is answering the question, well, how much production can the marginal worker take with him if he leaves agriculture? So you can think about this as sort of a worker leaves agriculture for the city, and how much production does this worker represent? So what's the average product that that worker average worker took with him, can take with him? Because initially, so this worker at the very beginning, when they were still in agriculture, they were producing W bar. So this same W bar this worker can take with them to the city. Yeah? So this is a way of thinking how much food is available to feed workers that move into industry. So another way so another thought experiment could be that that this surplus emerges because every worker still think about this that as a worker leaves, they still are entitled to the same food. Only now they have to. Only now the government takes that food from the agricultural sector and sells it to the worker when they're in the industrial sector. Now, this average surplus remains constant in the first phase because every worker has the same marginal product of zero, so it has the same average product. Agricultural production remains the same, so every worker's contribution, so every worker can take this W bar with them. As they leave, there's no effect on agricultural production. In the second phase, when we see a decline in agricultural production, we also see a decline in the average surplus. So every worker that leaves also means a reduction in agricultural production. So there's no longer an average surplus of W bar available for this worker to sustain themselves in the city. So another way of thinking about this in terms of production function, even though the total surplus increases from this level to that level, the average surplus, so the surplus per worker starts to decrease. And in this first part, we can also see why the average surplus is constant, because this part over here is a triangle. So every worker can basically take with them, or can still consume this W bar of food, even though they are no longer working on the land. So this clarifies the second part. Prices will start to increase as agricultural production starts to decrease, and thus average surplus starts to decrease. Um, so what are the implications then for the industrial sector? And for that, we need to understand how wages are determined in the industrial sector. So the general framework general principle is shown here. The industrial sector wages depend on wages in agriculture and the price of food. So the industrial workers need enough money from the factory owners to match what they earned in the agricultural sector and pay for the food that they now have to buy instead of that they grow it themselves. So putting these two together, we know what will happen to the wages in industry. So in the very beginning, we saw that throughout that in the first two phases, agricultural wages are constant, kept equal at W bar. In this first phase, prices of agricultural products remain constant because the average surplus remains constant, while in the second phase, the average surplus starts to decrease, and thus prices of food start to increase. So in the second phase, we should see increasing industrial wages, while in the third phase, these wages in industry will rise even more rapidly because not only do we have rising prices of food, but at that point, we also start to see rising prices, rising agricultural wages. Now, two important assumptions here. First of all, the price of food is determined domestically, so there's no trade here to simplify the discussion. And second, as emphasized before, the agricultural wage is constant until commercialization. So that assumes this surplus food is taken out of the agricultural sector and used by the government for something else. It's removed from the model, so to say. Now, putting these two together, we get to the industrial labor market. And here, the first issue is key, and that's already shown in the simplified model, is the labor demand curves. As industry is profitable, they can invest, and as they invest, their demand for labor starts to increase, and shifting out this industrial labor demand curve. But the crucial thing is the labor supply curve. Now, to say labor supply curve in the basic model was nearly horizontal, and that's also the first part. During the surplus labor phase, the unlimited supply of labor, the demand curve remains constant. Sorry, the supply curve remains constant. Why is that? Well, because WM, the industrial wages, remain constant. As long as that is the case, so the industrial wages remain constant. So at the original wage, there's, at least in the beginning, an unlimited supply of labor. Until you, of course, you get to the disguised unemployment phase. So unlimited is perhaps a bit of a misnomer. At this point, industrial wages have to rise to compensate for rising food prices. Now, this has a big impact on the process of industrialization, because as we see here, as the demand curve shifts out, we get a big increase in industrial labor, going from X to Y. But as the supply curve starts to rise, the pace of industrialization slows down, because even though the demand curve for industrial labor has shifted out quite a lot, we now get to point Z rather than Z prime. So if we want to know what happens to the pace of industrialization in this Lewis model, we need to understand how the supply curve of industrial labor will evolve. As long as that supply curve is flat or doesn't rise rapidly, industrialization can occur rapidly. As soon as the supply curve starts to increase, the pace of industrialization also slows down. Okay, thank you. So we hope to have clarified here the connection between, on the one hand, uh, the agricultural sector, where initially uh, production is constant and then starts to decrease, but wages remain constant. The food market, where the average surplus tells us what happens to the prices of food. As the average surplus starts to decrease, food prices start to increase. And putting those together, we get an expression for the industry wages, depending on agricultural wages and the price of food. So that taken together gives us the full scope of the Lewis model and explains the linkages between agricultural development and industrial development. Thank you very much.